I'm Gracie, and I'm 22 years old. I was standing in the hospital hallway when the machine flatlined, and my father's hand went cold in mine. 2 days later, my stepmother Helena threw my belongings onto the front lawn like garbage and screamed, "Take your things and get out of my sight." But here's the thing about karma. Sometimes it takes exactly 72 hours to show up. The heart attack came without warning. Dad was only 58, strong as an ox, or so we thought. 1 minute he was laughing at something on his phone. The next he was clutching his chest in our kitchen, gasping for air. I called 911 while Helena stood there frozen, more concerned about her makeup running than helping him. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt completely helpless watching someone you love slip away. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but it felt like hours. I rode with Dad while Helena followed in her Mercedes. Wouldn't want to mess up her leather seats with hospital germs, after all. The EMTs worked on him the entire ride, their faces grim. I held his hand and whispered every prayer I'd ever learned. At the hospital, they rushed him into surgery. Helena and I sat in the waiting room, surrounded by the antiseptic smell and fluorescent lighting that makes everything feel surreal. She kept checking her reflection in her compact mirror, reapplying lipstick like we were at a social event instead of fighting for my father's life. "He'll be fine," she kept saying, more to herself than to me. "Richard's too stubborn to die. He has too much to live for." The way she said it made my skin crawl, like she was already calculating what that too much might be worth. Dr. Martinez emerged after 4 hours, his scrubs wrinkled and his expression telling the story before he opened his mouth. "I'm sorry," he began, and those 2 words shattered my world into a million pieces. Helena's gasp seemed theatrical, her hand flying to her chest in a perfect display of grief, but I caught something else in her eyes, something that looked almost like relief. The thought made me sick, so I pushed it away. This was my father's wife. Surely she loved him. The next few hours blurred together. Phone calls to family members, arrangements to be made, a funeral home to choose. Helena took charge immediately, making decisions with an efficiency that struck me as odd for someone supposedly devastated by loss. "Don't worry about anything, sweetie," she said, patting my shoulder like I was a child. "I'll handle all the arrangements. You just focus on grieving." Her voice dripped with fake sympathy, but I was too numb to question it then. That night, alone in my childhood bedroom, I stared at the ceiling and tried to process that my father was really gone. The man who taught me to drive, who walked me through calculus homework, who promised he'd always be there to protect me, gone at 58 from a heart attack that no one saw coming. What I didn't know was that Helena was already making plans that would change my life forever. Plans that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with greed. The funeral was a perfectly orchestrated performance, and Helena was the star. She wore black Chanel, tears falling at precisely the right moments, accepting condolences with the grace of a seasoned actress. If I didn't know better, I'd have believed she was truly heartbroken. But I did know better. I'd been watching her for 8 years. Dad met Helena when I was 14. She was 32, beautiful, and had a way of making him feel like the most important man in the world. Within 6 months, she'd moved into our house. Within a year, they were married. I never quite understood what she saw in my father. He was successful, sure, but Helena always seemed like she was auditioning for a better role. The church was packed. Dad had been well-loved in our community, a successful businessman who treated his employees fairly and donated generously to local charities. Helena basked in the sympathy, playing the grieving widow with Oscar-worthy performance. "Richard was everything to me," she sobbed into the microphone during her eulogy. "I don't know how I'll go on without him." The congregation murmured sympathetically, tissues appearing throughout the pews. I spoke after her, my voice steady despite the grief threatening to choke me. I told stories about Dad's terrible dad jokes, his Sunday morning pancakes, the way he still checked under my bed for Monster 7 when I was too old to believe in them. Real memories of a real father who loved his daughter unconditionally. When I finished, I noticed Helena's expression had shifted. The mask of grief slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. It was gone so quickly I almost thought I'd imagined it. At the reception, Helena worked the room like a politician, accepting sympathy and praise for her strength during this difficult time. She clung to the arm of Marcus Thompson, her lawyer friend who'd been helping with Dad's business affairs. I'd never liked Marcus. Something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. "Poor Helena," I heard Mrs. Patterson whisper to her husband. "How will she manage that big house all alone?" The comment struck me as odd. Helena wouldn't be alone. I lived there too, didn't I? That evening, after the last guest had left, I found Helena in Dad's study, going through his papers with Marcus. They looked up when I entered, and Marcus quickly closed the folder he'd been examining. Just handling some immediate concerns, Helena said smoothly. Legal things that can't wait. You wouldn't understand, sweetie. There was that patronizing tone again, the one that made me feel like an unwelcome child in my own home. Maybe I could help, I offered. Dad taught me about the business. It was true. He'd been preparing me to potentially join the company after college, explaining contracts and financial statements during our weekend drives. Marcus and Helena exchanged a look that excluded me completely. That's sweet, Helena said. But this is grown-up business. Why don't you go rest? You look exhausted. I was being dismissed from my own father's study by people going through his private papers without me, but I was too tired and grief-stricken to fight. I kissed Helena's cheek goodnight, tasting the metallic tang of her makeup, and headed upstairs. From my bedroom, I could hear them talking late into the night, their voices low and urgent. I caught fragments. Transfer of assets, will reading, timeline, words that should have included me but somehow didn't. That night, I dreamed of Dad warning me about something, but I couldn't quite hear what he was saying. His mouth was moving urgently, his eyes filled with concern, but the words were lost in a rushing sound like wind through trees. I woke with a sense of foreboding that I couldn't shake. Something was coming, something that would change everything. I just didn't know what. 2 days after the funeral, Helena showed her true colors, and let me tell you, they weren't pretty. I came home from coffee with my friend Sarah to find Helena standing in the foyer, her arms crossed and her expression arctic. Gone was the grieving widow from the funeral. In her place stood a woman I barely recognized, cold and predatory. Sit down, Gracie. We need to talk. I remained standing, suddenly aware that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics of our house. What about? Helena's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. About your future. About how things are going to work now that your father is gone. The way she said it made my blood run cold. This is my home, I said quietly, but my voice carried more confidence than I felt. Was your home? She corrected. Your father left everything to me, Gracie. The house, the business, the bank accounts, everything. You're 22 years old. It's time you learn to stand on your own 2 feet. The words hit me like a physical blow. That can't be right. Dad would never. Your father was a practical man, Helena interrupted. He knew I could manage his affairs properly. You're just a college student with no real-world experience. What would you do with a multi-million-dollar estate? I stared at her, trying to process what I was hearing. This woman who had lived in our house for 8 years, who had eaten at our table and slept in my father's bed, was throwing me out like unwanted trash. You have until this afternoon to pack your things, she continued, checking her manicured nails with casual indifference. I'm having the locks changed at 5 o'clock. Where am I supposed to go? The question came out smaller than I intended. Helena shrugged. That's not my problem anymore. You're an adult. Figure it out. She reached into her purse and pulled out a handful of 20s. Here's $500. Consider it charity. The bills fluttered to the floor between us like leaves. I didn't pick them up. This is insane, I whispered. Dad just died. You can't throw me out while I'm grieving. Life doesn't stop for grief, sweetie. Helena's voice was ice cold now. The real world doesn't care about your feelings. I suggest you learn that lesson quickly. I ran upstairs and called my father's lawyer, Mr. Patterson, with shaking fingers. The call went straight to voicemail. I tried his office number, but his secretary said he was in court all day and couldn't be reached until tomorrow. Panic rising in my throat, I began throwing clothes into a duffel bag. 8 years of my life in this house, and it was being erased in a matter of hours. Photos with Dad, books he'd bought me, the necklace he'd given me for my 18th birthday. I grabbed what I could carry. Downstairs, Helena was directing 2 men as they changed the locks on every door. She didn't look up when I appeared with my bag. Oh, good, you're ready, she said dismissively. The locksmith needs to finish his work. Helena, please. I tried one last time. This is my father's house. There has to be some mistake. Take your things and get out of my sight, she screamed, her composure finally cracking. I'm sick of looking at your pathetic face. You're nothing but a reminder of a life I never wanted. The venom in her voice stopped me cold. This wasn't grief-talking or stress or temporary insanity. This was who Helena really was underneath the performance. She'd been waiting 8 years to show me exactly what she thought of me. I dragged my belongings to the front lawn, where she proceeded to throw them out the door like garbage. My clothes, my books, my laptop, the framed photo of Dad and me at my high school graduation, everything landed in a heap on the grass. The neighbors were watching now, faces pressed to windows, whispers carrying across the manicured lawns of our exclusive subdivision. Helena didn't care. If anything, she seemed to enjoy the spectacle. Don't you dare come back, she hissed from the doorway. This property is mine now, and you're trespassing. I stood on the sidewalk, surrounded by the remnants of my life, watching the only home I'd ever known become a fortress against me. Helena slammed the door with a finality that echoed through my chest. Sarah arrived 20 minutes later, her face pale with shock. I came as soon as I got your text. Gracie, what the hell happened? I couldn't answer. I just stood there staring at the house where I'd lived for 22 years, now completely locked against me. The message was clear. You don't belong here anymore. You never really did. Sarah's apartment became my refuge, but even surrounded by her kindness, I felt like I was drowning. For 3 days, I existed in a fog of disbelief and grief, jumping every time my phone rang, hoping it might be Helena calling to say she'd made a terrible mistake. Instead, I got something much more interesting. But first, let me tell you about those 72 hours of hell. Sarah lived in a studio apartment near campus, barely big enough for one person, let alone two. I slept on her couch, my belongings stacked in garbage bags against the wall like a refugee camp. I can't believe she actually threw you out, Sarah said for the 100th time, bringing me another cup of coffee I wouldn't drink. Your dad just died. What kind of person does that? The kind of person I'd been living with for 8 years without really seeing, apparently. The signs had been there. The way Helena's eyes would go flat when Dad wasn't looking. How she'd redirect conversations away from my accomplishments. The subtle digs disguised as concern. I'd been too naive to recognize them for what they were. Meanwhile, Helena was apparently having the time of her life. Sarah showed me Helena's Instagram posts, each one more nauseating than the last. Starting my new chapter, sometimes God closes one door to open another. Shaksa blessed, for new beginnings, Shaksa strong women. The photo showed her raising a champagne glass in Dad's study, his portrait visible in the background. She'd posted it the morning after, throwing me out. The comments were full of support from people who had no idea what she'd really done. Thinking of you during this difficult time. You're so brave. Your strength is inspiring. Richard would be so proud. If they only knew. If they could see her standing over my belongings scattered across the front lawn, screaming about wanting me out of her sight, they might sing a different tune. The worst part was learning she'd already started selling Dad's things. I drove by the house, from a distance, respecting her threats about trespassing, and saw strangers loading Dad's workshop tools into a truck. Tools he'd taught me to use, that we'd built my first birdhouse with when I was 7, gone to the highest bidder. His vintage car collection was next. Cars he'd lovingly restored, spending weekends in the garage explaining carburetors and timing chains, while I handed him tools and listened to stories about his own father. I watched from across the street as a dealer loaded his prize 1967 Camaro onto a trailer. Each sale felt like another piece of my father disappearing, erased by a woman who'd never understood what any of it meant. On the third night, I finally broke down completely. The grief I'd been holding back since the hospital came pouring out, not just for Dad's death, but for the systematic destruction of his memory, for the home I'd lost, for the cruel lesson in how little family meant to some people. She's erasing him, I sobbed into Sarah's shoulder. She's selling everything that made him who he was, like none of it mattered. Maybe you should call that lawyer again, Sarah suggested gently. There has to be something wrong here. Parents don't just leave their children with nothing. I'd tried reaching Mr. Patterson twice more, but his office kept saying he was dealing with estate issues and would call me back. The longer I waited, the more convinced I became that Helena was right. Dad had left everything to his wife, and I was now officially an orphan in every sense that mattered. The money Helena had thrown at me was already running low. $500 doesn't go far when you're suddenly homeless, and I couldn't keep imposing on Sarah's kindness forever. I started looking at want ads, trying to figure out how to build a life from absolutely nothing. That's when my phone rang on the afternoon of day 3, and everything changed. The number was unfamiliar, but something made me answer instead of letting it go to voicemail. Maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was fate finally deciding to throw me a bone. Is this Grace Margaret Patterson? The voice was professional, formal. Yes, this is Gracie. Who's calling? This is Jonathan Wright from Wright, Williams & Associates. We're handling your father's estate. Miss Patterson, we've been trying to reach you for 3 days. Why haven't you attended the will reading? I nearly dropped my phone. What will reading? Helena said Dad left everything to her. She said there was nothing for me to... The lawyer's laughter cut me off, rich and disbelieving. Miss Patterson, did you actually read your father's will? Because Helena inherited precisely nothing. The world stopped spinning. I couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what I was hearing. Helena inherited nothing? Then what was she doing in Dad's house, selling his things, throwing me out like garbage? Miss Patterson, are you there? Mr. Wright's voice sounded concerned now. I'm here, I managed to whisper. But I don't understand. Helena said, I think you'd better come to my office immediately. he said gently. There are some things you need to know about your father's final wishes. And Miss Patterson, you might want to bring a friend for moral support. This is going to be quite a shock. Have you ever experienced betrayal so complete it physically hurt? Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever discovered that everything you believed was a lie. Trust me, you won't want to miss what I learned next. An hour later, Sarah and I sat in the polished mahogany office of Wright, Williams and Associates, facing a distinguished gentleman in his 60s who looked like he'd stepped out of a legal drama. Mr. Wright's expression was serious, but there was something almost satisfied in his eyes, like justice was finally being served. Your father was a very intelligent man, Miss Patterson, and he was also very aware of his wife's true nature. He opened a thick folder and pulled out several documents. Richard Patterson came to us 6 months before his death, requesting a complete revision of his will and estate planning. 6 months? I whispered. But why? Mr. Wright leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. He'd discovered some disturbing information about Helena and her relationship with Marcus Thompson. Phone records, credit card statements, hotel receipts. Your father hired a private investigator. My stomach dropped. She was cheating on him for over 2 years, according to our evidence. But it gets worse. They were planning to, how do I put this delicately, significantly shorten your father's life expectancy. Sarah grabbed my hand as the words sank in. You mean they were planning to kill him? We had strong suspicions, but insufficient proof for criminal charges. Your father was more concerned with protecting you than pursuing legal action against them. Mr. Wright pulled out a document with Dad's familiar signature. This is your father's actual will, signed and witnessed just 4 months ago. He slid it across the desk to me. You inherit 95% of your father's estate, Miss Patterson. The house, the business, all financial accounts and investments. Current estimated value is approximately $33 million. I stared at the papers, the words blurring together. $33 million. The house, the business. Everything Helena thought she'd stolen was actually mine. But Helena, I began. Helena was designated to receive $2 million, Mr. Wright continued, contingent on one very specific condition. What condition? Sarah asked when I couldn't find my voice. Mr. Wright's smile was grim. That she treat you with dignity and respect following your father's death, maintaining your position in the family home until you reached the age of 25, or chose to live independently. The irony was so perfect it was almost funny. Almost. She failed that condition pretty spectacularly, I managed. Indeed. By throwing you out of the house and claiming you had no inheritance rights, Helena violated the terms of the bequest. She now receives nothing. 0. Not a penny. I thought about Helena standing in the foyer 3 days ago, so confident in her power over me, so certain she'd won. She'd played herself spectacularly, and she didn't even know it yet. There's more, Mr. Wright said, producing another set of documents. Your father also left detailed instructions about what to do if Helena attempted to claim assets that weren't hers. We've already begun the process of freezing all accounts she's accessed illegally. She's been selling his things, I said. His tools, his cars. All sales will be reversed. Any buyers will be refunded and asked to return the items immediately. His expression hardened. Helena has been committing fraud on a spectacular scale. I sat back in the leather chair, trying to process the magnitude of what I was learning. Dad had known. Somehow, he'd known exactly what Helena would try to do, and he'd protected me even from beyond the grave. But there was one thing I still didn't understand. If this will exists, how was she able to throw me out? How did she access any accounts? Mr. Wright's expression grew troubled. That's where things get complicated, Miss Patterson. Helena has been operating with a forged will and falsified documents. She and Marcus have committed multiple felonies. The pieces of Helena's perfect plan were about to come crashing down around her, and she had no idea what was coming. The next morning, reality came knocking on Helena's door in the form of several very serious men in suits, and one very terrified stepmother who was about to learn that karma has a sense of humor. But let me back up and tell you how we got there. After leaving Mr. Wright's office, I felt like I was walking in a dream. Sarah kept squeezing my arm to make sure I was real, muttering things like $33 million and I can't believe that witch under her breath. My emotions were all over the place. Relief, anger, grief, and a weird sense of vindication all tangled together. The first order of business was securing the assets Helena had been pillaging. Mr. Wright made some calls, and by evening, every account she'd accessed had been frozen. The house locks would be changed back the next morning, and all fraudulent sales would be reversed. She's going to panic when her credit cards stop working, Sarah observed with grim satisfaction. I spent that night writing a letter to Dad, thanking him for protecting me even when he couldn't be there to do it in person. The man I'd thought had abandoned me had actually fought for me in the most comprehensive way possible. He'd seen through Helena's facade and prepared for exactly what happened. The next morning, Mr. Wright called with an update that made my jaw drop. "Miss Patterson, we've discovered the extent of the fraud. Helena and Marcus created an entirely fake will, complete with forged signatures and false witness statements. They've been planning this for months." "How did they think they'd get away with it?" I asked, genuinely bewildered by the stupidity of their plan. "Greed makes people sloppy," he replied. "They assumed you'd be too grief-stricken and naive to question anything. They didn't count on your father's thoroughness or our due diligence." That afternoon, I decided it was time to reclaim my home. Sarah drove me to the house where a locksmith was already at work under Mr. Wright's supervision. Helena's Mercedes sat in the driveway, but the house was oddly quiet. "She's been calling the bank all morning," Mr. Wright informed me with barely concealed amusement. Apparently her cards were declined at Nordstrom, and the bank told her the accounts were frozen pending investigation of fraudulent activity. We walked through the front door of my house, and I felt a weight lift from my chest that I hadn't even realized was there. Everything looked the same, but the energy was completely different. This was my space again, my father's space, not some shrine to Helena's deception. I found her in Dad's study, frantically shoving papers into a briefcase while talking on the phone with someone who was clearly not giving her good news. When she saw me, her face went through several interesting color changes. "You!" she hissed, ending her call abruptly. "What are you doing here? I had the locks changed." "And I had them changed back," I said calmly, stepping into the room that had been forbidden to me just days before. "This is my house, Helena. It's always been my house." Her laugh was high and brittle. "Your house? Gracie, you're delusional. Your father left everything to me. I have the will." "You have a fake will," Mr. Wright interrupted, stepping into the room behind me. "One that constitutes multiple federal crimes. Helena Morrison Thompson, you're under investigation for fraud, forgery, and theft." The color drained from her face completely. "That's impossible. Marcus is also under investigation," Mr. Wright continued. "In fact, the FBI is quite interested in speaking with both of you about your creative interpretation of inheritance law." Helena sank into Dad's chair, my chair, looking smaller and more desperate than I'd ever seen her. "There has to be some mistake. Richard promised you $2 million if you treated me with dignity after his death," I said, walking around to face her directly. "Instead, you threw me out of my own home and told me I was nothing. Congratulations, Helena. You played yourself." The briefcase fell from her hands, papers scattering across the floor. Among them, I caught sight of bank statements, property deeds, and other documents she'd clearly been planning to steal. Even faced with the truth, she was still trying to take what wasn't hers. "You don't understand," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "Marcus and we had plans, investments. We needed the money." "You needed my father's money," I corrected. "Money that was never going to be yours because Dad figured out exactly who you really were." For 8 years, this woman had made me feel small and unwelcome in my own home. She'd patronized me, dismissed me, and ultimately discarded me like trash. Now she was sitting in my father's chair, begging me to understand her perspective. The irony was almost too perfect. Almost. "There's something else you should know," Mr. Wright said, pulling out another folder. "Your father left instructions for us to investigate any suspicious circumstances surrounding his death. The autopsy results came back this morning." Helena's face went ashen. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, standing up straighter than I ever had in my life, "that you and Marcus aren't just thieves. You're also suspects in a murder investigation." The woman who had thrown me out of my home while my father's body was barely cold was about to learn that some things are bigger than greed. And karma, as it turns out, has a very long memory. Helena's phone call came exactly 47 minutes after the FBI agents left our driveway, and let me tell you, desperation has a very specific sound. My phone buzzed while I was standing in Dad's study, my study now, watching Mr. Wright catalog evidence of Helena's crimes. The name Helena flashed on the screen, and I almost laughed at the irony. 3 days ago, I would have been terrified to ignore her call. Now I had all the power. I let it ring 4 times before answering just because I could. "Hello, Helena." My voice was calm, almost bored. "Gracie!" Her voice was frantic, high-pitched with panic. "Oh, thank God you answered. There's been some terrible mistake." "The only mistake," I interrupted smoothly, "was Dad marrying you in the first place." Silence. Then, "You don't understand. The FBI came to the house. They said things. terrible things about Marcus and me. They froze all the accounts. I know, I had them frozen. I examined my nails while she sputtered in shock. Amazing what happens when you actually read the real will. What do you think will happen next? Drop your predictions in the comments below and hit that subscribe button if you've ever wanted to see a gold digger get what she deserves. Trust me, Helena's about to learn that karma is a very patient collector. You can't do this. Helena's voice cracked. I'm your stepmother. We're family. Family? I repeated, genuinely amused now. Helena, you threw my belongings on the front lawn like garbage 3 days after my father died. You told me to get out of your sight. You said I was nothing but a reminder of a life you never wanted. Each word landed with surgical precision. That's not family. That's cruelty. I was grieving, she protested. People say things when they're in pain. No, Helena, you were celebrating. I saw your Instagram posts, starting my new chapter while his body wasn't even cold in the ground. Through the phone, I could hear her breathing getting ragged. Good. Let her feel a fraction of what I felt standing on that sidewalk surrounded by my scattered life. Gracie, please, she whispered. There has to be something we can work out. I'll give you money. With what money? I asked sweetly. Oh, wait, you don't have any money. Because it was never yours to begin with. Wright caught my eye and held up a folder. More evidence, judging by his expression. Whatever was in there, Helena wasn't going to like it. Listen carefully, I continued, my voice hardening. Every account you accessed illegally has been frozen. Every item you sold is being returned to the estate. Every document you forged is evidence in a federal investigation. You and Marcus played a game you didn't understand against an opponent you underestimated. Your father loved me, she cried. One last desperate attempt at emotional manipulation. He wouldn't have wanted this for us. I felt a surge of anger so pure it surprised me. My father knew exactly what you were, Helena. That's why he protected me from you even after death. He knew you'd show your true colors the moment he couldn't stop you. And that's not true. There's something else you should know, I said, watching Mr. Wright open that folder. Dad left more than just a will. He left recordings. The silence on the other end was deafening. Recordings? Her voice was barely a whisper. Hours of them. Video diaries documenting his suspicions about you and Marcus. Financial irregularities. Strange behavior. Evidence of your affair. I paused for effect. Evidence of much worse things than affair. You're lying. Am I? He was a smart man, Helena. Smarter than you gave him credit for. He knew something was wrong with his health problems. He knew they started after you began helping with his medications. I let that sink in. The FBI is very interested in those recordings. I could hear her crying now, ugly sobs that held no sympathy for me. This was the woman who'd made me feel unwelcome in my own home for 8 years, who'd stood over my belongings scattered across the lawn and screamed about getting me out of her sight. Helena, I said gently, my voice taking on the exact patronizing tone she'd used on me countless times. You're an adult. Figure it out. I hung up before she could respond, the sound of her desperate sobs cut off mid-breath. It felt better than I'd expected it to. Mr. Wright looked up from his folder, impressed. That was well handled, Miss Patterson, professional but firm. I learned from the best, I replied. My father always said the best revenge is success. But sometimes, I added with a small smile, the second best revenge is watching someone destroy themselves with their own greed. The folder in his hands contained security footage from Dad's office building, showing Helena and Marcus meeting secretly for months before Dad's death, meeting and planning and celebrating things that hadn't happened yet. Things were about to get much worse for Helena, and honestly, she'd earned every bit of what was coming. The next morning brought revelations that made Helena's fraudulent will look like amateur hour. Turns out, when you're stupid enough to document your crimes in writing, the FBI tends to notice. Mr. Wright arrived at the house with Detective Rodriguez and Agent Chen, their arms full of evidence boxes that told a story even darker than I'd imagined. Dad hadn't just suspected Helena and Marcus were stealing from him. He'd known they were planning something much worse. Your father was methodical, Detective Rodriguez explained as we sat in the living room surrounded by documents. He started recording everything 6 months before his death, including private conversations with Helena and Marcus. Conversations about what? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer would be horrible. Agent Chen pulled out a digital recorder and placed it on the coffee table. This was hidden in his study. Are you prepared to hear this, Miss Patterson? It's difficult. I nodded, bracing myself for whatever came next. Helena's voice filled the room, tinny through the old recording device but clear enough to understand every poisonous word. The old fool trusts me completely, she was saying to someone, presumably Marcus. His medication routine is so complex he'd never notice one extra pill here and there. something to weaken his heart gradually. My blood turned to ice. She wasn't just talking about stealing from Dad, she was talking about killing him. Marcus's voice came next, cold and calculating. The private investigator is getting too close. We need to move faster than planned. If Richard dies of heart failure, no one will question it. He's already had 2 minor episodes. Episodes I'd attributed to stress from work. Episodes that were apparently caused by my stepmother slowly poisoning my father. Just a few more weeks, Helena continued. Then everything will be mine, and we can finally get rid of that spoiled little brat. Gracie will be so devastated by Daddy's death, she won't question anything. Agent Chen stopped the recording. There are 18 hours of conversations like this, Miss Patterson. Your father documented everything. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I'd just heard. Helena hadn't just been cheating on my father, she'd been methodically planning to murder him, and once he was dead, she'd intended to throw me out of my own home, which is exactly what she'd done. But Dad died of a natural heart attack, I said weakly. The doctors said his heart gave out suddenly, Detective Rodriguez corrected. But given this evidence, we've ordered a full toxicology workup on his remaining tissue samples. If Helena was poisoning him with the right substances, they would have left traces. Mr. Wright spread out financial documents across the coffee table. We've also discovered that Helena and Marcus forged your father's signature on multiple business documents over the past year. They've been systematically stealing from his company accounts. The scope of their betrayal was staggering. This wasn't just about inheritance fraud. It was about a sustained campaign to destroy my father's life and steal everything he'd worked for, all while smiling at the dinner table and playing the loving wife. There's something else, Agent Chen said carefully. We found evidence that Helena has been married to Marcus Thompson for 3 years. Married? My voice came out as a squeak. But she was married to my father. She was married to both of them, Detective Rodriguez confirmed. Bigamy is a federal crime, and it also invalidates any potential claim she might have had to your father's estate. So Helena wasn't just a murderer and a thief. She was also a bigamist who'd been living a completely false life for years. The devoted wife routine was just another layer in an elaborate con game. How long were they planning this? I asked, still struggling to comprehend the depth of their deception. Based on the evidence since before she married your father, Mr. Wright replied grimly. This was a long-term operation. They researched his business, his assets, his family situation. Helena specifically targeted him as a wealthy widower with a young daughter. The calculated nature of it made me sick. Dad had genuinely believed he'd found love after Mom died. Instead, he'd invited a predator into our home, someone who'd spent 8 years planning his murder while sitting at our dinner table. But Dad figured it out, I said, finding comfort in that thought. He protected me. He did more than that, Agent Chen replied, producing another evidence bag. He gathered enough evidence to put them both away for decades. Your father was building a case against them when he died. Looking through Dad's hidden files was like reading a thriller novel, except the victim was my father and the villains had been living in our house. Bank statements showing unauthorized transfers, hotel receipts proving Helena and Marcus's affair, even photographs of them together, laughing and celebrating while Dad was supposedly at work. In one particularly damning photo, Helena was wearing jewelry I'd never seen her wear around Dad, expensive pieces that Marcus had obviously bought her with stolen money. They looked happy, relaxed, like a couple planning their future together, a future that required my father to be dead. The last folder contained something that made my hands shake, a draft letter in Dad's handwriting addressed to me. My dearest Gracie, it began. If you're reading this, then the worst has happened, and I wasn't able to expose Helena and Marcus before they carried out their plan. Please know that everything I've done has been to protect you. I couldn't finish reading it then. The thought of Dad knowing he was in danger, knowing the people he trusted were planning to kill him, and still thinking about protecting me instead of himself, it was too much. But I would finish reading it later. Because Dad had been right about everything, and Helena was about to learn that some crimes don't go unpunished, no matter how clever you think you are. The FBI was building a case that would put her away for the rest of her life, and honestly, it couldn't happen fast enough. Helena's arrest happened on a Tuesday morning, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't enjoy every single second of it. I was having coffee on my front porch, yes, my front porch, in my house that Helena had tried to steal, when the convoy of FBI vehicles pulled into the driveway. Helena came running outside in her designer pajamas, probably thinking she could charm her way out of trouble one more time. She was wrong. Helena Morrison Thompson, Agent Chen announced, his voice carrying across the manicured lawn for all the neighbors to hear. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, forgery, bigamy, and theft of federal assets. Watching Helena's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally pure terror was better than any therapy session. This was the woman who'd made me feel small and unwelcome for 8 years, who'd thrown me out of my home while my father's body was still warm, who'd screamed at me to get out of her sight like I was nothing. Now she was the one being removed from the property in handcuffs. "This is a mistake," she shrieked as they led her to the patrol car. "I'm innocent. Gracie, tell them I'm innocent." I stood up from my porch chair, coffee cup in hand, and called back in my sweetest voice, "Sorry, Helena, I don't lie to federal agents." I took a deliberate sip of my coffee. "Good luck figuring it out, though. You're an adult, right?" The satisfying click of those handcuffs would echo in my memory for years. Marcus was arrested at his law office the same morning, pulled out of a meeting with clients while FBI agents seized his computers and files. His law practice, built partly on money stolen from my father, crumbled within hours as clients fled, and his license was immediately suspended. By noon, the story was all over local news. Stepmother arrested in plot to murder wealthy businessman and steal inheritance. The headlines wrote themselves, and they were not flattering to Helena's carefully crafted image. Channel 7's afternoon broadcast opened with footage of Helena being led away in handcuffs, followed by interviews with neighbors who suddenly remembered thinking something was off about her. Amazing how many people claimed they'd never trusted her, when just days before they'd been commenting supportive messages on her grieving widow Instagram posts. "We always thought there was something cold about her," Mrs. Henderson from next door told the reporter, conveniently forgetting how she'd gushed about Helena's strength at Dad's funeral. Poor Richard never saw it coming. The media coverage was relentless. Helena's social media accounts were dissected by internet sleuths who found inconsistencies in her timeline. Her fake widow performance at the funeral was replayed endlessly, with body language experts pointing out signs of deception I'd been too grief-stricken to notice at the time. My favorite segment was when they interviewed Mr. Patterson, Dad's longtime friend and former lawyer, who revealed that Dad had come to him 6 months before his death, with concerns about Helena's behavior. "Richard was a smart man," Mr. Patterson said on camera. "He knew something wasn't right, but he hoped he was wrong. He loved Helena, or thought he did. Learning the truth broke his heart before the poison did." The poison. The toxicology results had come back positive for a cocktail of substances that would cause gradual heart failure when administered over time. Helena had been slowly killing my father for months, probably planning to inherit everything and disappear with Marcus to some tropical paradise. Instead, she was sitting in a federal holding cell wearing orange jumpsuit, facing charges that would put her away for life. The business community rallied around Dad's memory once the truth came out. Colleagues shared stories of his integrity, his kindness, his love for his daughter. The narrative Helena had tried to create, of a devoted wife tragically widowed, was replaced with the truth: a predator who'd targeted a good man and destroyed him for money. "Richard Patterson was one of the finest men I ever knew," his business partner told Channel 12. "The idea that someone would murder him for money is sickening. I'm just glad Gracie survived their plans." Survived their plans. That phrase hit me hard when I heard it, because I realized how true it was. If Dad hadn't been so thorough in documenting their crimes, if the real will hadn't been properly executed, Helena and Marcus might have gotten away with murder and left me with nothing. Dad had literally saved my life from beyond the grave. That evening, I sat in his study reading the complete letter he'd left for me, the one I couldn't finish before. It was 8 pages of love, wisdom, and detailed instructions for rebuilding my life after his death. He'd known Helena would try to destroy me, and he'd prepared countermeasures for every possible scenario. "You are stronger than you know," he'd written. "Stronger than Helena, stronger than her cruelty, stronger than the pain she'll try to cause you. Don't let her win by making you bitter. Live well, love freely, and remember that being kind doesn't mean being weak." Outside, news vans were still parked across the street, hoping for an interview with the daughter who'd inherited everything her stepmother tried to steal. But I had nothing to say to them. The story was simple. Good had triumphed over evil, and justice was being served exactly as it should be. Helena had gambled everything on one final con game, and she'd lost spectacularly. Now she had decades in federal prison to think about what greed and evil had cost her. Somehow, I didn't think she'd learn anything from the experience. But that was her problem now, not mine. 3 weeks after Helena's arrest, she called me from federal prison, and honestly, her desperation was almost amusing. Almost. The call came through collect, which meant I had to actually accept the charges to hear what she had to say. I was curious enough about her mental state to pay the $2. Consider it entertainment expenses. "Gracie," she began, her voice small and broken, completely different from the commanding tone she'd used to order me out of my own home. "I know you're angry with me, but you have to understand—" "Actually, I don't have to understand anything," I interrupted. settling back in Dad's leather chair with my feet up on his desk. But I'm curious what new story you've invented to make yourself the victim here. I loved your father, she insisted, tears evident in her voice. Whatever the FBI thinks they found, whatever Marcus told them, I genuinely loved Richard. I almost laughed. Helena, you were married to Marcus while you were married to Dad. For 3 years. That's not love, that's bigamy. Silence. Then, that was complicated. What's complicated about it? You stood in a church and promised to love and honor my father while you were already legally married to another man. You took vows you couldn't legally make while planning to murder the man you claimed to love. The marriage to Marcus was a mistake, she whispered. Something that happened before I met your father. I tried to end it. You tried to end it by slowly poisoning Dad with heart medication. My voice stayed calm, but the anger was building. Because that's not how divorce works, Helena. She was crying now, ugly sobs that carried no sympathy from me. This woman had thrown me onto the street like garbage, stolen everything my father had worked for, and systematically murdered the only parent I had left. Her tears meant absolutely nothing. You don't understand the pressure I was under, she continued. Marcus threatened me, said he'd ruin me if I tried to leave him. So you decided to ruin my father instead? I pulled out the folder of evidence Agent Chen had shared with me, including photos of Helena and Marcus laughing together in expensive restaurants while Dad was dying at home. These pictures tell a different story, Helena. You look pretty happy for someone being blackmailed. Those were taken out of context. Which context explains you wearing a bracelet that cost $40,000? Money stolen from Dad's business accounts? I flipped to another photo. Or this one of you and Marcus celebrating at a jewelry store, buying wedding rings 3 months before Dad died? More silence. Helena wasn't prepared for me to have the actual evidence, probably because she'd underestimated me for so many years. In her mind, I was still the naive college student who'd believe whatever story she told. There's something else I think you should know, I said, enjoying the power shift more than I probably should have. The FBI found your real plan. What do you mean? Your computer files, Helena. The ones you thought you'd deleted. I read from Agent Chen's report. Fake obituary for me. Dated 3 months after Dad's planned death. Tragic car accident, they were thinking. Make it look like grief made me careless. The sharp intake of breath on her end told me everything I needed to know. They hadn't just been planning to steal my inheritance. They'd been planning to kill me too, once the estate was settled and my existence became inconvenient. That's not... I would never... You would and you did, I said firmly. You planned to murder me, Helena. Just like you murdered Dad. The only difference is he figured it out in time to stop you. Gracie, please, she begged, her voice breaking completely. I know I made mistakes, but we can work this out. Family forgives family. We're not family. The words came out harder than I intended, carrying 8 years of accumulated hurt and anger. We never were family. You were a parasite who fed on my father's kindness until you killed him for it. I was your mother for 8 years. You were my father's wife, I corrected her. There's a difference. A mother protects her children. A mother doesn't throw them out on the street while they're grieving. A mother doesn't plan their murder for financial gain. I could hear her sobbing, probably hoping the emotional breakdown would manipulate me into sympathy. It was the same strategy she'd used throughout my childhood, turning on the tears whenever she wanted something. But I wasn't a child anymore, and I'd learned to recognize her performances for what they were. The prosecution offered me a chance to make a victim impact statement at your sentencing, I said calmly. I haven't decided whether I'll do it. Part of me thinks you're not worth the energy. Gracie, please don't make this worse than it already is. Worse than what, Helena? Worse than murdering my father? Worse than planning to murder me? Worse than throwing me onto the street like trash while I was grieving? I shook my head, even though she couldn't see it. There is no worse. You already did the worst possible things. Now you get to live with the consequences. I hung up before she could respond, cutting off her desperate pleas mid-sentence. Let her spend the next 30 years thinking about what her greed had cost her. The house felt peaceful without her voice polluting it. Outside, autumn was settling over the neighborhood, painting the trees in brilliant shades of gold and red. Dad had always loved this season. I made myself dinner in the kitchen where Helena had pretended to love my father while slowly poisoning him. Tomorrow, I'd start the process of redecorating, removing every trace of her presence from our home. But tonight, I'd simply enjoy the silence of a house finally free from predators. 6 months later, I was running Dad's company and living my best life when Helena made one final, pathetic attempt to contact me. This time, it wasn't a phone call. It was a letter, handwritten on prison stationery and delivered through her lawyer. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. Sometimes you need to know just how far someone will sink. Dear Gracie, it began in Helena's still perfect penmanship. I hope this letter finds you well. I've had time to reflect on my actions, and I want you to know how deeply sorry I am for the pain I've caused. I was reading this in my office, Dad's old office that I'd completely redesigned in soft blues and greens instead of his traditional dark wood. Through the windows, I could see the garden I'd planted in his memory, full of his favorite flowers that Helena had never allowed in the house because they attracted bees. I know you have no reason to forgive me, the letter continued, but I hope you can find it in your heart to visit me. There are things about your father that you deserve to know, things that might help you understand why I made the choices I did. Even from prison, Helena was still trying to manipulate me, still trying to make herself the victim, still hinting at some secret knowledge that only she possessed. It was pathetic, really. I set the letter aside and returned to the quarterly report spread across my desk. Dad's company, my company now, was thriving under new leadership. I'd hired experienced managers to handle the day-to-day operations while I learned the business, and profits were up 18% from last year. More importantly, the company culture had shifted dramatically. Where Dad had been somewhat formal and traditional, I encouraged innovation and creativity. We'd launched 3 new product lines, expanded into digital markets, and created an employee profit-sharing program that had the whole staff energized. Miss Patterson, my assistant Janet, knocked on the door. "There's someone here to see you. Says she's Helena Thompson's daughter?" I looked up, confused. Helena doesn't have a daughter. That's what I thought, but she's very insistent. Says it's about her mother's trial testimony. Intrigued, I had Janet show the woman into my office. She was probably 25, with dark hair and nervous eyes, carrying a worn folder like a shield against the world. "Miss Patterson, thank you for seeing me. I'm Rebecca Chen. Helena was my mother. Well, adoptive mother, but that's complicated." I gestured for her to sit, my mind racing. Helena had never mentioned having children, adoptive or otherwise. "What can I do for you, Rebecca?" She opened the folder with shaking hands. "I was raised by Helena and Marcus when my biological parents died. I was 12. I thought they were good people who'd saved me from foster care." She pulled out several documents. I found these in Marcus's office after his arrest. The first document made my blood run cold. It was a life insurance policy on me, dated 3 years ago, with Helena listed as the beneficiary. The second was a detailed plan for staging my death to look like a suicide caused by grief over Dad's death. "They were going to kill you," Rebecca said quietly, after the estate settled, after Helena had control of everything. They had it all planned out. The suicide note, the timing, even which bridge they were going to throw you off. I stared at the papers, my hands surprisingly steady. Somehow, learning about my planned murder felt less shocking than it should have. Maybe I'd already processed the worst of Helena's betrayal, or maybe I'd simply run out of capacity for horror. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears. "Because I need you to know that not everyone around them was evil. I had no idea what they were planning. When the FBI arrested them, I thought it was all some terrible mistake." She wiped her eyes. "I've been living with the guilt, wondering if I could have stopped them somehow." "Rebecca, you were a victim too," I said gently. "They used you, just like they used everyone else." I wanted to testify against Helena at the trial, but the prosecution said my testimony wasn't necessary. They had enough evidence without me. She looked up with red eyes. "I needed you to know that someone from that house cared about justice." I walked around the desk and sat in the chair next to her, leaving the power dynamic behind. "What happened to you after their arrest?" "Foster care initially. But I'm 25 now, and I've been working to rebuild my life. I changed my name back to my birth name, got a job, started therapy." She managed a small smile. "I heard you were running your father's company successfully. I wanted to see the person Helena tried to destroy." We talked for another hour about her life with Helena and Marcus, about the subtle signs of their criminality that she'd been too young to understand, about the way they'd used her presence to appear more normal and family-oriented. She'd been a prop in their con game, just like I had been. Before she left, Rebecca handed me one final document. "I found this in Helena's papers. I think it's something your father wrote." It was a letter in Dad's handwriting, addressed to no one in particular, but clearly meant for me. "If something happens to me," it read, "please make sure Gracie knows that I see Helena for who she really is. I've tried to protect my daughter while gathering evidence, but if I don't survive Helena's plans, please tell Gracie that her safety and happiness are worth more than any amount of money. Tell her to live freely, love deeply, and never let anyone make her feel small again." The letter was dated just 1 week before he died. Dad had known he was running out of time, but he'd still been thinking about my future, my happiness, my freedom from Helena's influence. After Rebecca left, I sat in my office reading Dad's final message over and over. He'd known Helena would try to destroy me, and he'd prepared for that possibility in every way he could. The will, the evidence, the recordings. Everything had been designed to ensure that his daughter would survive and thrive after his death. I picked up Helena's prison letter and fed it into the shredder without finishing it. Whatever lies or manipulations it contained, I didn't need to hear them. Dad had told me everything I needed to know. Live freely, love deeply, and never let anyone make me feel small again. Helena could spend the rest of her life in prison wondering if I'd ever visit, ever forgive, ever give her another chance to hurt me. The answer was no. Some bridges, once burned, should stay burned. The final confrontation came 2 years later, in a courtroom where Helena sat in shackles, facing me for the last time. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by prison orange and the weight of her crimes. But her eyes still held that calculating coldness I remembered from my childhood. I was there to deliver my victim impact statement, something I'd avoided during the original trial but finally felt ready to do. The prosecution had called to let me know Helena was appealing her sentence, claiming she'd been coerced by Marcus into participating in Dad's murder. Even from prison, she was still lying. Your Honor, I began, standing at the podium with Dad's letter folded in my pocket for strength. Helena Thompson didn't just murder my father. She murdered the idea of family that I'd believed in for 8 years. Helena's lawyer had probably coached her to look remorseful, but I could see through the performance. She was scanning the courtroom, probably looking for sympathetic faces, calculating her next manipulation. The defendant wants this court to believe she was a victim of Marcus Thompson's influence, I continued. But the evidence shows she was an equal partner in planning my father's death. She researched his medications, administered the poison, and played the grieving wife while he suffered. I pulled out photographs from the evidence file. Helena and Marcus celebrating at expensive restaurants while Dad was dying at home, bank statements showing their systematic theft from his accounts, hotel receipts proving their 3-year affair. She also planned to murder me, I said, watching Helena's composure crack slightly. Not in a moment of passion, but methodically, systematically, as part of a financial plan. My death was literally budgeted into their scheme. The judge listened intently as I described Helena's treatment of me after Dad's death. The immediate eviction, the public humiliation, the casual cruelty of throwing my belongings onto the lawn like garbage. But here's what Helena didn't count on, I said, my voice growing stronger. She didn't count on my father's intelligence, his love, or his determination to protect me even after death. Every move she made, he'd anticipated. Every crime she committed, he'd documented. I reached into my bag and pulled out a tablet. Your Honor, there's one piece of evidence that wasn't available during the original trial. My father recorded a video message shortly before his death, which we discovered on an encrypted drive in his safety deposit box. Helena's face went white as I played the video for the court. Dad appeared on screen, looking tired but determined, sitting in his office late at night. If you're watching this, Gracie, then Helena and Marcus succeeded in killing me. I want you to know that I figured out their plan weeks ago. I know about the bigamy, the theft, the slow poisoning, and their plan to murder you after the estate settled. Helena was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of a criminal watching her final lie exposed. I could have had them arrested immediately, Dad continued on screen, but I needed to gather enough evidence to ensure they could never hurt you or anyone else. Every conversation was recorded. Every financial crime was documented. Every murder plan was preserved. The video continued with Dad explaining his decision to let Helena and Marcus think their plan was working while he built an unbreakable case against them. He'd known he was going to die, but he'd used his final weeks to ensure justice would be served. Helena Thompson is not a victim, I told the court as the video ended. She's a predator who spent 8 years studying my father's kindness, learning his routines, earning his trust, all so she could exploit and ultimately destroy him. She deserves every day of the sentence she received. Helena's appeal was denied within hours. The video evidence was so damning that even her lawyer looked embarrassed to be defending her. As they led her back to prison, she turned to look at me one final time. I hope you're happy, she hissed, her mask finally slipping completely. I am, I replied honestly. Not because you're in prison, but because Dad's plan worked perfectly. He protected me from you even after death. I left the courthouse feeling lighter than I had in years. Outside, reporters were waiting for comments, but I had only one statement prepared. Richard Patterson was a loving father who built a successful business through hard work and integrity. He died protecting his daughter from people who saw his kindness as weakness. Today, justice was served and his legacy is secure. That evening, I hosted a dinner party at the house, the first formal entertaining I'd done since Dad's death. The guest list included Rebecca, who'd become a close friend, Janet and several colleagues from the company, and Dr. Martinez, who'd tried to save Dad's life and had become something more than a friend over the past year. We ate in the dining room where Helena had once held court, but the space felt completely different now. Where her presence had been cold and calculating, our conversations were warm and genuine. This was what family was supposed to feel like. After dinner, I stood in Dad's garden, my garden now, and thought about how much had changed. Helena was serving 3 consecutive life sentences. Marcus had died in federal prison 6 months earlier, apparently from natural causes, though no one mourned his passing. Rebecca was finishing nursing school and planning to work with trauma victims. And me? I was running a successful business, surrounded by people who valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide them. I'd learned to trust my instincts about people, to recognize manipulation, and to set boundaries that protected my peace. The house felt peaceful in a way it never had when Helena lived here. I'd redecorated completely, removing every trace of her presence and filling the space with light, color, and genuine warmth. Dad's portrait hung in the living room, but it was surrounded by photos of people who actually loved us: colleagues, friends, chosen family. 3 years ago, Helena had thrown me onto the street thinking she'd won the ultimate victory. Instead, she'd freed me from her influence and triggered the chain of events that would destroy her completely. Sometimes karma takes its time, but when it arrives, it's beautifully thorough. I raised a glass of wine to Dad's portrait and whispered, "Mission accomplished." Somewhere in federal prison, Helena was probably still trying to manipulate her cellmates, still convinced she was the victim of everyone else's cruelty. But that was her problem now, not mine. I had a life to live, a business to run, and a future full of people who actually deserved my trust. Dad would have been proud of the woman I'd become, and that was all the victory I needed. The game Helena thought she'd won had been over before she'd even started playing. She just hadn't been smart enough to realize it. But Dad had been smart enough for both of us. And in the end, that was all that mattered.